Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Tonight we're going to tell the story of the most consequential conqueror in human history. A man who began his life as a starving child on the Mongolian steppe, abandoned by his tribe, sleeping under felt and eating rats and pine nuts to survive, and who died the ruler of an empire larger than any that had existed before or has existed since. An empire that at its greatest extent covered more than 24 million square kilometres, roughly a fifth of the Earth's entire land surface. An empire that connected China to Persia to Russia to the doorstep of Western Europe in a single political structure, eliminating the trade barriers and the political borders that had separated those civilizations for centuries. An empire built in the span of a single human lifetime, by a man whose beginning gave no particular indication that it was coming. The man born as Temüjin around 1162 on the banks of the Onon River in what is now northeastern Mongolia is known to history by the title he was given at the Great Assembly of Mongol Chiefs in 1206, Genghis Khan. The title means, roughly, universal ruler. The ruler not merely of one tribe or one confederation, but of everything, of the sky and the earth simultaneously, of the world in its entirety. The title was an ambition stated as an accomplished fact, and the extraordinary thing about Temüjin is that he spent the next 21 years of his life making it approximately true. He conquered more territory in those 21 years than the Roman Empire accumulated in 4 centuries of expansion. He killed, by the most credible estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40 million people, roughly 10% of the entire human population of the world at the time. And the population loss in certain regions of Asia and Eastern Europe was severe enough to be detectable in the atmospheric carbon record more than 700 years later. He also built something, a legal code, a trade network, a system of religious tolerance, a postal system, an administrative framework that the world he'd conquered used for generations, and that certain historians have argued was one of the most significant engines of globalization in pre-modern history. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding them simultaneously is part of what makes the story of Genghis Khan one of the most demanding historical narratives to tell, honestly. He was not the cartoon villain that the conquered civilization's histories made him into, though the violence was real and the scale of it staggering. He was not the misunderstood statesman that a certain revisionist enthusiasm has sometimes overcorrected toward. He was a man of his specific time and place, whose values were the values of the steppe, whose ambitions exceeded anything the steppe had previously produced, and whose achievement transformed the medieval world in ways whose consequences are still visible in the political and cultural geography of Eurasia today. That is the story we are here to tell. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. It makes a real difference, and it is the only thing I will ask. And as always, leave your city and your local time in the comments, because knowing that this is settling over different parts of the world simultaneously is something I always find quietly moving. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. Find a position you can hold through a long story without having to shift. The Mongolian steppe is vast and the night sky over it is extraordinary, and we're going to be out under it for a while. You have nowhere to be. Let us begin. The Mongolian steppe is one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth, and the civilization that it produced was shaped by its demands with an intimacy that no other environment produced in quite the same way. The steppe is an enormous grassland and stretching from Manchuria in the east to Hungary in the west, roughly 5,000 miles of grass and sky, interrupted by mountain ranges and river systems, but essentially continuous in its ecological character. and it is a landscape of extremes. The winters reach 50 degrees below zero in the interior. The summers bring heat and drought. The wind is nearly constant. Rain falls in amounts too small to support agriculture in most of the region. The grass supports livestock. The livestock support the people who follow them across the landscape in the annual migrations that the seasonal availability of grazing requires. Everything on the steppe flows from this fundamental logic. The grass feeds the animals feed and clothe and transport the people, and the people's entire material culture is built around the ability to move with the animals wherever the grass takes them. The nomadic pastoralism that resulted from this ecological logic was not a primitive or undeveloped form of human life. It was an extraordinarily sophisticated adaptation to a specific environment requiring a level of practical knowledge about weather, about animal behavior, about navigation across a largely featureless landscape, about the management of large herds in conditions of variable forage availability, that no settled agricultural civilization has ever fully matched. The Mongol herder who could read the weather from the formation of clouds on the horizon, who understood the nutritional requirements of horses and cattle and sheep and camels across the seasonal cycle, who could find water in a landscape that appeared waterless, and navigate by stars across hundreds of miles of identical grassland, possessed a body of practical intelligence that modern technological civilization has largely lost, and that was, in its specific context, as sophisticated as anything the literate urban civilizations of China or Persia were producing simultaneously. The material culture of the steppe was designed for mobility. The gi, the round felt tent that Westerners call a yurt, could be assembled in under an hour and disassembled in roughly the same time, packed onto ox-drawn carts or onto the backs of camels, and moved with the household's entire material possessions across whatever distance the season required. The felt that formed its walls and roof was produced from sheep's wool, matted rather than woven, and provided insulation against both the extreme cold of winter and the heat of summer, in a way that the permanent structures of settled civilizations could not match for portability. The interior of a gyr was organized with a spatial logic that every Mongol understood. The hearth at the center, the honored position at the north, the women's side to the east and the men's side to the west, the household's most valuable objects displayed on the northern wall opposite the entrance, and the regularity of this interior organization meant that every gyr in the Mongol world was a recognizable version of every other, creating a portable cultural environment that persisted across thousands of miles and multiple generations. The horses were central to everything. The Mongol relationship with horses was more intimate than that of any other horse culture in history, partly because the horses of the steppe were a specific breed, small, sturdy, capable of surviving on the minimal forage available in winter by pouring through snow to reach the grass beneath. Extraordinarily hardy and capable of sustained effort over distances that larger breeds could not match. And partly because a Mongol child learned to ride before he or she learned to walk steadily, and the horse was as fundamental to daily existence as the gyr itself. A wealthy Mongol might own hundreds of horses. An average household maintained several dozen. The Mongol warrior rode with a remuda, a string of horses, typically 5 to 10 for a fighting man on campaign, and switched mounts regularly to maintain the pace of advance that made Mongol cavalry tactics so difficult to counter. This string of horses, sustained across the landscape by the same grass that fed the herds of cattle and sheep, gave Mongol armies a mobility that no settled civilization's military force could replicate. Before we enter the political world of the steppe, it is worth dwelling more carefully on the material world of the people who inhabited it. because the specific details of daily life on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century are both intrinsically fascinating and essential context for everything that follows. A people's military capacity, their political possibilities, their cultural assumptions, all of these emerge from the material conditions of existence, and the material conditions of the Mongol world were unlike those of any of the settled civilizations they would eventually conquer. The diet of a Mongol household was, by the standards of settled agricultural civilizations, extremely limited in variety and extremely high in protein and fat. The primary foods were meat and dairy products. The same animals that provided transport and wool and labour also provided food, and the Mongol relationship to their livestock was the relationship of people who understood that the herd was simultaneously wealth, vehicle, clothing, and dinner. Red meat was the core protein, supplemented by dried meat that could be preserved for months and carried on campaign. The dried pulverized meat mixed with fat that Mongol warriors carried in their saddlebags was a concentrated field ration of considerable caloric density that could sustain a rider for days without requiring a fire or a cooking vessel. Dairy products were central: fresh milk, fermented mare's milk, kumis, the mildly alcoholic beverage that was the Mongol equivalent of beer or wine, made by fermenting the milk of mares and consuming it fresh, or storing it in leather bags that continued the fermentation, and the various dried and processed dairy products that allowed the summer's milk surplus to be concentrated and preserved for the winter months. The grain, vegetables and fruit that formed the dietary base of the Chinese and Persian and European civilizations they would encounter were largely absent from the Mongol diet, which gave Mongol warriors a distinctive metabolic adaptation to sustained physical effort on a high-protein, high-fat diet that the soldiers of settled civilizations accustomed to carbohydrate-heavy diets did not share. The clothing of the steppe was, like its architecture, designed for mobility in extreme conditions. The del, the long robe worn by both men and women, made of wool in winter and lighter fabric in summer, belted at the waist with long sleeves that could be let down over the hands in cold weather, was the universal garment, adaptable to conditions from -40 to +40 Celsius by the layering of multiple dells of increasing weight. Boots of thick leather, with pointed toes and high heels specifically designed for stability in the stirrup, were among the most important items of equipment that a Mongol family produced and maintained. The felt that lined the winter dell and covered the floor of the ger was produced from sheep's wool by a labour-intensive process of wetting, rolling and compressing the fibres into a dense mat that insulated against cold and shed water better than any woven fabric of equivalent thickness. The specific technical knowledge required to produce good felt, to read the fibre, to manage the moisture content, to roll and compress to the right density, was women's knowledge, part of the same body of practical expertise in textile and food production that the Mongol household division of labour assigned to women, and that was as essential to the group's survival as the men's knowledge of animal husbandry and military tactics. The seasonal cycle that governed Mongol life was organised around the movements of the herds, and those movements were determined by the availability of grass at different elevations and latitudes across the different seasons. In summer, the herds moved to high pastures where the grass was fresh and abundant, and the temperatures were bearable for the animals. In winter, they descended to lower elevations where the snowfall was lighter, and the animals could paw through the surface to reach the dried grass beneath. The Mongol household moved with its animals through this cycle, breaking camp and reassembling it at each new location with the practiced efficiency of people who had done it dozens of times and for whom the gear's assembly and disassembly were as automatic as putting on boots. The large wheeled carts that transported the household's possessions, including in the case of very wealthy households, entire jers mounted on carts and pulled by teams of oxen without disassembly, were one of the most distinctive elements of the Mongol material world, and they gave the household's periodic relocations a character more like a deliberate procession than the frantic movement of people fleeing difficult conditions. The political organization of the steppe before Temüjin was tribal and confederal, organized around kinship groups that formed and dissolved in response to the pressures of the moment. The basic unit was the household, the extended family group that shared a ger cluster and moved together. Households combined into clans, clans into tribes, and tribes occasionally into larger confederacies under a strong leader. But these larger structures were inherently unstable, because the steppe's political culture did not recognize the kind of inherited authority that settled civilizations took for granted. A Khan's authority depended on his ability to provide military success and material reward to his followers, and followers who felt their Khan had failed them were free, within the steppe's political logic, to take their households and their herds elsewhere. The result was a political landscape of constant flux, alliances forming and breaking, strong leaders rising and declining, confederacies assembling under capable warriors and dissolving when those warriors died or failed. The relationship between the steppe peoples and the settled civilizations on their edges was one of the most important structural features of Eurasian history for 2 millennia before Genghis Khan, and understanding it is essential to understanding what he eventually built. The steppe produced warriors of extraordinary skill and mobility, but relatively little in the way of the material goods, silk, grain, iron, manufactured objects, that the steppe people wanted and that only settled civilizations could produce. The settled civilizations produced those goods, but were chronically vulnerable to the mobile raiding capacity of steppe peoples, whose cavalry could appear, strike, and disappear across the frontier faster than any agricultural army could respond. The result was a long-established system of managed interaction, trade at frontier markets, tribute payments from Chinese dynasties to steppe confederacies, occasional conquest and settlement in either direction, that shaped the political boundaries and the cultural exchanges of Eurasia across centuries. Genghis Khan's achievement was not to initiate the steppe-settled world relationship, but to transform it utterly, using the tools the steppe had always provided, but in combinations and at scales that no previous steppe leader had managed. Temüjin was born into this world in approximately 1162, though the precise year is uncertain. The secret history of the Mongols, the primary source for his early life, was written down after his death and compresses and mythologizes its chronology in ways that make exact dating difficult. His father was Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of sufficient standing to arrange a marriage alliance with the Ongirat tribe, and of sufficient daring to have recently captured a Tatar warrior named Temüjin, from whom he named his firstborn son, in the Mongol tradition of commemorating significant events in children's names. The family was not among the most powerful on the steppe. The Borjigin were a respectable clan, but not a dominant one. And Temüjin's childhood was shaped by a series of events that would have destroyed most children, and that instead produced something that the steppe's demanding environment had been quietly selecting for across generations. The first catastrophe came when Temüjin was approximately 9 years old. Yesugei was returning from delivering his son to the Ongirat camp to begin the customary betrothal period with his intended bride Berta, when he stopped to eat with a group of Tatars. The Tatars recognized him as an old enemy and poisoned his food, or so the secret history records. though the specific mechanism of a slow-acting poison that allowed Yasuge to ride home before dying, which is what the text describes, requires some skepticism. Yasuge died shortly after returning to his camp. He left behind a widow, Huelun, and 5 children, of whom Temüjin was the eldest, in a camp that promptly abandoned them. The abandonment was not cruelty in the steppe's own terms, though it reads as such through modern eyes. A chieftain's authority on the steppe derived from his ability to provide for and protect his followers, and a dead chieftain's dependent family was a liability. Mouths to feed, no fighting capacity to contribute. A drain on resources that a mobile, survival-oriented community could not easily afford. The Taichiut clan, which had been associated with Yasuge's camp, took their households and herds and left, without the family that could no longer contribute to anyone's survival. Huelun and her children were left to survive alone on the steppe. What followed was several years of genuine destitution that the secret history describes with a specificity that has the ring of transmitted memory rather than literary invention. The family ate wild plants, roots, pine nuts, fish from the rivers, small game, whatever could be found on a steppe that provided generously to those with herds and horses and very little to those without. Huelun proved to be a woman of extraordinary resilience and practical intelligence, maintaining the family's survival through conditions that most Mongol women of her status would never have faced, and transmitting to her children, above all to Temüjin, the specific combination of toughness, adaptability, and refusal to accept circumstances as permanent that his subsequent career would display in ways that changed the world. The first crisis that tested the adolescent Temüjin directly was the murder of his half-brother Begta. Begta was somewhat older than Temüjin and had asserted a dominance over the household resources, taking food, claiming the right of the elder male, that Temüjin and his full brother Yoshikasa found intolerable. The 2 brothers consulted their mother, who counselled patience, and then ignored her counsel and shot Begta with arrows in a planned ambush. The murder of a half-brother over food resources is not a story that makes Temüjin straightforwardly admirable, and the secret history presents it with the moral ambivalence it deserves. Huelun's fury at her son's action is preserved alongside the action itself, but it also demonstrates, in miniature, the quality that would define Temüjin's entire subsequent career. The willingness to do what the logic of the situation required regardless of the social or moral constraints that a more conventional person would have observed. He was 11 or 12 years old. The second major crisis was his capture by the Taichiut, the clan that had abandoned his family after his father's death, who found the growing Temüjin and his household threatening enough to warrant seizure. He was taken prisoner and placed in a kang, a wooden yoke that prevented independent action, and kept in the Taichiut camp as a captive of low status. He escaped during a feast night when the guards were distracted, hid in a river, was spotted by a sympathetic Taichiut man named Sorkan Shira, who chose not to report him, and eventually reunited with his family. The episode demonstrated both the precariousness of his position and the quality that people who encountered him seemed consistently to recognize. A personal force that inspired loyalty in strangers, even strangers who had no reason to risk themselves on his behalf. The great early alliance of his life, the one that set him on the path from surviving fugitive to rising chieftain, was his recovery of his wife Berta, who had been taken by the Merkit tribe in a raid that was itself a revenge for his father's earlier kidnapping of Huelun. The Merkits seized Berta and distributed her among their warriors. Temüjin's response was to seek help from 2 men, Togrul, the Khan of the powerful Kerate tribe, who'd been his father's sworn brother and owed obligations of kinship alliance, and Yamuka, a man of his own Borjigin clan who was Temüjin's Anda, sworn brother, blood brother, a bond that on the steppe carried the obligations of kinship without the biology. With their combined forces, Temüjin and his allies raided the Merkit camp, recovered Berta, and launched Temüjin's military career. Berta was pregnant when recovered, and the child she bore, Yochi, who would become one of Temüjin's most important military commanders, was of uncertain paternity, a fact that the secret history acknowledges with unusual directness, and that would become a source of tension within the royal family for decades. Temüjin acknowledged Yochi as his son, raised him as his heir alongside his other children, and never, in any surviving record, repudiated the boy, a decision that reflected both practical political wisdom and perhaps something about the nature of the bond between Temüjin and Berta that is genuinely visible in the sources if you look for it. Berta was the one constant of his adult life, the senior wife and the political partner whose counsel he sought and sometimes followed, and her recovery was the action that launched him into the politics of the steppe, with enough momentum to begin building the coalition that would eventually become the Mongol Empire. Before we can appreciate what the unification of the Mongols meant, we need to understand the political landscape of the steppe that Temüjin was navigating, because he was not simply unifying one people, but subduing an entire ecosystem of competing powers, each with their own histories, their own military capabilities, and their own relationships with the powerful settled civilizations on the steppe's edges. The Tatars were the most immediate and most personal enemy, the people who had poisoned his father, who had given his own name to the son they were trying to honor through the customary practice of naming children after defeated enemies. The Tatars were a confederation of several tribes in the eastern steppe, powerful enough to serve as a buffer force for the Jin dynasty of northern China, which paid them tribute and occasionally used them as proxies against other steppe peoples. The Tatars' relationship with the Jin was the specific feature of steppe politics that Temüjin would eventually use against them. In 1202, he allied with the Jin to conduct a campaign against the Tatars, using Chinese military support to help destroy the confederation that had killed his father, and then, characteristically, applied the ruthless post-defeat policy that eliminated the Tatar leadership while incorporating the surviving population into his own confederation. The Kerit were a powerful tribe in the central Mongolian steppe, whose Khan Togrul had been his father's sworn brother, and whose support had been essential in the recovery of Berta. The Kerit were Christians, Nestorian Christians, members of the Church of the East that had spread across Central Asia along the Silk Road in the early medieval centuries, and Togrul himself was a figure of considerable political sophistication who'd spent years in exile at the Jin court in northern China, and had absorbed something of the administrative culture of a major settled civilization. He was also, by the time of Temüjin's rise, an old man whose own position was complicated by internal family politics, and whose value as an ally Temüjin cultivated with the careful attention that a subordinate who intends eventually to surpass his patron gives to maintaining the relationship until the moment of supersession has arrived. The final conflict between Temüjin and Togrul in 1203. When Togrul, alarmed by Temüjin's growing power and persuaded by his son Sengum and others that the alliance had become a threat, attempted to destroy his former protégé, was the decisive military confrontation of the unification period, and Temüjin's victory effectively ended the Kerit as an independent political force, incorporating their people and their territory into the Mongol Confederation. The Naimans occupied the western steppe, were also Nestorian Christians, and had the specific distinction of having a functioning script, the Uyghur alphabet that the Naimans used for administration, which Genghis Khan would adopt as the writing system for the Mongol language, and which the Mongol Empire would use for centuries. The Naiman Khan Taiyang, who organized the last significant coalition against Temujin before the 1206 Kurultai, gathered the remnants of every confederation and every leader that Temujin had defeated or alienated, including the fugitive Jamuka, in a final attempt to stop the Mongol consolidation. The battle that followed in 1204, fought in the western Mongolian steppe, was the decisive military confirmation of what the political process had already largely accomplished. The Naimans were defeated, Taiyang was killed. Jamuka, having lost the last coalition that might have sustained him, entered the final phase of his career that ended in the confrontation with his blood brother described above. The Merkits, the tribe that had taken Berta, were defeated multiple times and scattered, but proved more resistant to final absorption than most. They were effectively broken as a military force during the unification period, but remnants fled into the western steppe and had to be pursued and destroyed across multiple campaigns. The specific persistence of Merkit resistance was partly a reflection of the terrain they retreated into, and partly a reflection of the depth of the blood feud that the original Berta kidnapping had created. Genghis Khan was patient with most enemies that submitted. He was not patient with the Merkits. The process by which Temujin unified the Mongol tribes between roughly 1185 and 1206 was not a straightforward military conquest. It was a political achievement of considerable sophistication, combining military force with the deliberate construction of a new kind of loyalty that's fundamentally different from the kinship-based allegiances that had governed steppe politics before him. This distinction matters enormously because it is what made his achievement durable in ways that previous steppe confederacies had not been. The traditional steppe political structure was built on kinship. You owed loyalty to your clan because the clan was your family, shared your blood, had obligations to protect and provide for you. When a great leader assembled a confederation, he was assembling an alliance of clans, each of which maintained its internal kinship structure and its own Khan, and each of which remained potentially available to dissolve the alliance and go elsewhere if the confederation's leader failed to deliver what the alliance required. The confederation was additive, a sum of its constituent parts, and its strength was limited by the willingness of those parts to remain associated. Temujin created something different. From relatively early in his career, he began the practice of accepting individuals, not clans or tribes, but individual men, into his personal following on the basis of merit and personal loyalty rather than kinship. A warrior who came to Temujin individually without his clan and pledged personal loyalty directly to Temujin himself was incorporated into Temujin's household as a nukud, a companion, a retainer in the personal service of the Khan. These men owed loyalty not to a clan structure that happened to be allied with Temujin, but to Temujin directly, personally, in a way that could not be dissolved by the dissolution of a clan alliance. They were, in effect, the nucleus of a new kind of steppe political structure, one in which the personal bond between leader and follower replaced the kinship bond as the primary political cement. This innovation had immediate military implications. An army built of personal retainers, directly loyal to a single leader, could be reorganized and redeployed in ways that a confederation of clan-based units could not. Temujin organized his army on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 that cut across clan and tribal boundaries, placing men of different origins in the same unit under commanders chosen for ability rather than hereditary standing. This reorganization broke the clan structure's military expression, creating an army whose cohesion derived from unit identity and personal loyalty to the Khan, rather than from kinship solidarity, and which therefore remained coherent under the kind of stress that fragmented traditional clan-based forces. The specific way Temüjin handled defeated enemies was another departure from steppe tradition that compounded over time into a decisive advantage. The conventional practice on the steppe was to incorporate the leaders of defeated tribes into the confederation hierarchy, preserving their status and their followers while binding them through oath to the conquering Khan. Temüjin sometimes did this, but he also developed the practice of executing the leaders of tribes that had resisted him to the point of significant battle, eliminating the potential sources of future rebellion while treating the ordinary fighters, the rank and file who had followed their leaders into battle without particular animus toward Temüjin himself, as recruitable into his own forces. The Tatars who had poisoned his father received an especially severe version of this treatment. Temüjin executed every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel, every adult male, in practical terms, and distributed the Tatar women and children among his followers. The Tatar clan structure was destroyed. The individual Tatar people survived as members of the Mongol Confederation, their identity absorbed rather than their bodies killed. It was brutal. It was also, by the logic of the steppe, efficient, eliminating the leadership that would have organized future resistance while preserving the productive human capital of the defeated group. The relationship with Yamuka, the blood brother, the Anda, the companion of his early career, was the personal tragedy of the unification period, and the secret history preserves it with a quality of genuine grief that distinguishes it from the otherwise fairly dry political narrative. Yamuka and Temüjin had been allies, blood brothers, men who had slept under the same blanket and shared everything in the manner the bond required. Then the political logic of the steppe pulled them apart. Both men had claims to leadership. Both men attracted followers. The confederation they had built together was not large enough for two leaders of comparable ambition, and the forces that formed around each of them gradually drew the two men toward inevitable conflict. They fought multiple times over 2 decades, with neither achieving definitive victory over the other, until Temüjin's political strategy of individual recruitment gradually eroded Yamuka's coalition base. In the end, Yamuka's own men captured him and brought him to Temüjin, hoping to gain favor by delivering their leader as a prisoner. Temüjin had the men who had betrayed Yamuka executed. Loyalty to a sworn leader was sacred, and men who betrayed their own Khan were the specific kind of man Temüjin's entire political project was built against. Yamusha himself was offered his life and a place of honor. He declined, reportedly asking for a noble death without the shedding of blood in the Mongol tradition reserved for those of royal blood. Temüjin granted it. The secret history records the moment with a restraint that suggests the weight of it was understood by the people who transmitted the account. The Kurultai of 1206, the great assembly of Mongol chieftains at the source of the Onon River, was the formal culmination of everything Temüjin had built across the preceding 2 decades. Every significant chief and clan leader of the Mongol world attended. The great white standard of 9 yak tails, the symbol of Mongol national identity that would be raised before every subsequent campaign, was planted before the assembled gathering. The shaman Tebtengeri proclaimed that the eternal blue sky, the supreme divine force in the Mongol cosmology, Tengri, who was understood as the patron and authorizer of legitimate political authority, had decreed that Temüjin should be the ruler of all people under the sky. The title Genghis Khan was proclaimed. A nation that had been a collection of warring tribes for as long as anyone could remember was suddenly, by the combination of conquest and ceremony and shared identity forged in war, a single political entity under a single ruler. The Yasa, the law code that Genghis Khan promulgated in connection with the Kurultai, though it was elaborated and extended across the following years, was one of the most important institutional innovations of his career, and its content and its intent have been more debated by historians than almost any other aspect of his legacy. The Yasa was not a written legal code in the sense that the Code of Hammurabi or Roman law were written codes. It was, in its original form, an oral pronouncement transmitted through the network of Genghis Khan's officials and recorded in a script that the Mongols had recently adopted from the Uyghurs, specifically to meet the administrative needs of the new state. It covered a wide range of subjects: the organization of the army, the obligations of conquered peoples, the rules of trade along the Mongol-controlled routes, the specific crimes and their punishments, and, in one of its most consequential provisions, the guarantee of religious freedom for all peoples under Mongol rule. The religious tolerance of the Yasa was not a product of Genghis Khan's personal indifference to religion. He appears to have had genuine religious sensibility, engaging with shamans and later with Buddhist monks and Christian priests and Muslim scholars with what the sources describe as sincere interest. It was a practical political decision, well suited to an empire that was in the process of conquering civilizations of half a dozen different religious traditions, and that needed to administer those civilizations without generating the kind of religious resistance that would have required permanent military occupation of every corner of the conquered world. An empire that guaranteed that you could practice your religion, that your clergy would be exempt from taxation, and that the Mongol state would protect your places of worship was an empire that could extract tribute and maintain order without requiring the kind of comprehensive cultural transformation that would have made conquest infinitely more costly. The postal system, the Yam network, that Genghis Khan established across the Mongol Empire was one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the pre-modern world. A series of relay stations spaced roughly a day's ride apart along the major routes across the empire, each maintained with fresh horses and provisions, allowed official messengers to cover distances of up to 200 miles a day, faster than any other communication system in the medieval world, and fast enough to give the Mongol administration a near real-time awareness of events across an empire that spanned from China to Persia. The Yam required the cooperation and labour of conquered populations to maintain. The obligation to provide horses and provisions for Mongol messengers was one of the standard duties imposed on conquered territories, but its benefits, in terms of the administrative control and the commercial facilitation it provided, made it one of the most lasting legacies of the Mongol Empire. Marco Polo, who traversed the empire several decades after Genghis Khan's death, described the Yam in detail and with evident admiration, and the system he described was recognizably the successor of what Genghis Khan had established. The campaigns that followed the Kurultai of 1206 were the application of the military machine that Temüjin had built across the preceding 2 decades to the conquest of the settled civilizations that surrounded the Mongolian steppe. The Mongol army that went to war against China and then Persia and then Russia was not a horde in the sense that the word implies in modern English: disorganized, uncountable, savage. It was a highly disciplined, meticulously organized military force that combined tactical flexibility with strategic coherence in ways that the armies of the settled civilizations it faced could not match. Understanding how it worked is essential to understanding how it achieved what it achieved. The fundamental unit of Mongol military power was the cavalry archer. Every Mongol warrior was trained from childhood in the 2 skills that defined his military utility: riding and archery. the composite bow that the Mongols used, laminated from wood, horn, and sinew in a recurved design that required months of skilled craftsmanship to produce, and that stored an enormous amount of energy in its relatively small frame, had a range and penetrating power that exceeded the longbows of medieval Europe and the infantry bows of the Chinese and Persian armies the Mongols faced. A skilled Mongol archer could hit a target at over 300 meters from horseback at a gallop, a combination of accuracy and mobility that no other military force in the medieval world possessed, and the Mongol warrior's ability to sustain combat over enormous distances, using his string of remount horses to maintain pace, and the herds that followed the army to supply food, gave the Mongol force an operational range that no settled army's logistics could match. The tactical system that the Mongols deployed with such devastating effect was built around a fundamental principle: avoid decisive close engagement with an enemy force till that force has been so disrupted by harassment, feints, false retreats, and encirclement that its cohesion is broken, and then annihilate it when it can no longer function as an organized military unit. The feigned retreat, the Mangudai, was perhaps the most famous Mongol tactical device, in which a portion of the Mongol force would attack an enemy formation, then turn and appear to flee in disorder, drawing the enemy cavalry in pursuit, only to lead the pursuers into an ambush of fresh forces that had been positioned to receive them. It required extraordinary discipline from the men performing the retreat, who had to maintain their formation and their timing while appearing to flee in panic, and it worked repeatedly against enemies who knew it was coming, because they lacked the training and the command structure to resist the psychological temptation of pursuit. The specific tactical repertoire of the Mongol army was more elaborate than the basic cavalry archer description suggests, and understanding its full complexity is important because it explains why settled armies that outnumbered the Mongols consistently lost to them. The Mongol commanders were not merely deploying faster and more mobile cavalry. They were executing tactical and operational plans of considerable sophistication that combined multiple arms, light cavalry harassment, heavy cavalry shock action, infantry assault, and increasingly sophisticated siege equipment, into a coordinated system that adapted to each specific enemy and each specific terrain in ways that European and Asian commanders of the period consistently found difficult to predict or counter. The Orkhon, the reconnaissance screen that preceded the main Mongol force, was the intelligence mechanism that made the tactical system work. Light cavalry scouts ranged far ahead of the main column, mapping the terrain, locating the enemy's forces, identifying their supply lines and their lines of retreat, and sending information back through the relay system. The Mongol command's situational awareness of the enemy force was typically far superior to the enemy's awareness of the Mongols, partly because Mongol-like cavalry operated with a freedom of movement that settled army reconnaissance could not match, and partly because the Mongol commanders used their intelligence actively, changing their plans in response to what the scouts reported rather than executing predetermined plans regardless of what they found. The result was an operational flexibility that the enemy consistently found disorienting, encountering Mongol forces at unexpected angles and in unexpected numbers. The Temüjin, the nominally 10,000-man unit that was the Mongol army's largest organized division, was commanded by generals who had typically risen through the ranks on the basis of demonstrated ability rather than hereditary standing, though the most senior commands were usually held by members of the royal family. The specific generals who distinguished themselves in Genghis Khan's campaigns: Jebe, who had originally shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle before being captured and impressed, and who subsequently became one of the most talented cavalry commanders in the Mongol army. Sube'etei, the iron-willed strategist who would eventually plan the Western campaigns against Russia and Eastern Europe. Mughal, who managed the Jin campaign in northern China with a mixture of military force and diplomatic skill, were men of a specific type, completely loyal to Genghis Khan personally, completely committed to the success of the campaign operationally, and completely without the kind of political ambition that might have led them to use their military positions as leverage for personal advantage. The specific relationship between Genghis Khan and his senior generals was one of the most important institutional achievements of his career. He had created a command structure in which ability was rewarded and loyalty was absolute, and the combination produced military effectiveness that the fractured command structures of most of his enemies could not match. The use of terror as a deliberate policy tool deserves direct examination, because it was not incidental to the Mongol military system but integral to it. The calculation behind the deliberate massacre of populations that resisted was not purely punitive. It was strategic. By establishing an unambiguous rule, surrender promptly and be treated relatively well, resist and be destroyed, Genghis Khan was creating a decision environment for every subsequent city and every subsequent ruler that simplified their options. A ruler who knew that resistance would produce massacre, and that submission would produce taxation, and a degree of autonomy had a straightforward incentive calculation to make, and the consistency with which the rule was applied across campaign after campaign meant that the reputation of the Mongol forces preceded them, softening resistance before it was tested. Cities fell to Mongol forces that could not have been taken by direct assault, because the reputation of what happened to those that resisted was more effective than the actual military force available. The siege warfare that the Mongols developed as they encountered the walled cities of China and Central Asia was perhaps the most surprising element of their military evolution, because it required skills that nomadic steppe warriors had no traditional exposure to, and that the steppe military tradition had never needed to develop. Genghis Khan solved this problem with characteristic pragmatism. He recruited experts. Chinese engineers provided catapults and trebuchets. Persian engineers provided different techniques of undermining walls and constructing siege towers. Captured craftsmen of all kinds were segregated from the general population of conquered cities and put to work in the Mongol military engineering corps, which by the time of the Khwarezmian campaign of 1219 to 1221 was capable of reducing even the largest and most strongly fortified cities in Central Asia within weeks. The Khwarezmian Empire was the first great settled civilization that Genghis Khan turned his full attention to after the partial conquest of northern China, and its fate illustrates both the military capability that the Mongol machine had developed and the specific quality of the destruction that resistance to that machine produced. The Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II ruled a state that covered most of modern Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. A prosperous, cosmopolitan Islamic empire with cities of extraordinary cultural and commercial importance: Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Urgench. Muhammad II made the initial error of killing the ambassadors and merchants of a Mongol trade caravan, the specific provocation that transformed Genghis Khan's initially commercial intentions toward the region into the military campaign that destroyed it. The campaign that followed in 1219 to 1221 was one of the most devastating military operations in human history. But to feel the specific weight of what was lost and destroyed, it helps to understand what the Khwarezmian world was before the Mongols arrived, because Central Asia in the early 13th century was not a peripheral region of the medieval world, but one of its most sophisticated and cosmopolitan centres. Samarkand, which served as the practical capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, was one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a metropolis of perhaps 400,000 people, the entrepot at the crossing of the main Silk Road routes, where Chinese silk and Persian metalwork and Indian spices and Roman glass had been traded for centuries before it became the center of a distinctively Central Asian Islamic civilization. The city's madrasas, Islamic schools, produce scholars of international standing. Its bazaars circulated goods from every corner of the known world. Its architecture, which the subsequent Timurid Renaissance would eventually rebuild in the spectacular forms that survive today, was already a tradition of considered beauty in the Persian style. The specific quality of the Islamic Golden Age that the 13th century represented, the translation and preservation of Greek philosophy, the development of mathematics and astronomy and medicine that the Islamic world had been advancing for 4 centuries, was present in Samarkand and in the other great cities of the region in a concentration that no other part of the world could match. Bukhara, which fell first to Genghis Khan's advance from the unexpected desert direction, received a treatment that the Persian historian Juvaini, writing a generation later, described in terms that have become the iconic image of the Mongol conquest. Genghis Khan entered the Friday mosque, supposedly climbed the pulpit, and declared that he was the scourge of God sent to punish the people for their sins, and ordered the city's population to feed his horses with the grain stored in the mosque's courtyard, using the wooden cases that held copies of the Quran as feeding troughs. The story may be partially legendary. Juvaini had political reasons to portray the conquests in terms that emphasized their providential character, but the core facts are not disputed. Bukhara was taken, its population was forced onto the plain outside the city. The wealthiest were compelled to reveal their hidden valuables. The young men were enrolled in the Mongol forces for the assault on Samarkand, and the city was burned. The specific selection of the Mongol conqueror's treatment, who was killed, who was enslaved, who was enrolled in the army, who was spared, followed a logic that Genghis Khan applied consistently. Artisans and craftsmen were segregated and sent east to work for the Mongol state. Women and children of the right age were distributed as slaves among the Mongol forces. Scholars and administrators of proven competence were sometimes preserved for later use. Young men of military age were forced to serve in the vanguard of subsequent assaults. Samarkand's garrison of perhaps 110,000, swelled by refugees and its own confidence in its fortifications, attempted a sortie against the Mongol besieging force that was decisively repulsed. The subsequent negotiation, the garrison's commanders approaching Genghis Khan to discuss terms, produced one of the more extraordinary scenes of the campaign. The conquered garrison soldiers were marched out of the city and then separated. The native Samarkandis released after various penalties. The Turks, who had been the core of the professional garrison, killed because they were the soldiers of the Khwarezmian Shah and could not be expected to serve the Mongols without persistent risk of treachery. The population of Samarkand, hundreds of thousands of people, were ordered onto the plain outside the walls, divided into the now familiar categories, and processed according to the Mongol system. The city itself was pillaged rather than burned. Genghis Khan found it useful as a base of operations and as a source of skilled workers, and a Mongol governor was installed. The Samarkand that survived was a much smaller and much more controlled version of the city that had existed before. Its population reduced, its independence gone, its role transformed from commercial centre to administrative outpost. The campaign that followed in 1219 to 1221 was one of the most devastating military operations in human history. Genghis Khan divided his forces. His second son Chagatai and third son Ogedei were sent to besiege the heavily fortified city of Otrar, while his fourth son Tolui swept through Khorasan and Genghis Khan himself took the main force on an unexpected route through the Kizilkum Desert to appear before Bukhara from the north, cutting off the city from any possibility of relief. Bukhara surrendered. Samarkand, which had a garrison of perhaps 110,000 men, held briefly and then capitulated when Genghis Khan demonstrated that the Mongol siege capability was adequate to reduce it. City after city fell in rapid succession, and the pattern that emerged across the campaign would be repeated in every subsequent Mongol conquest. A city that surrendered promptly received relatively merciful treatment, taxation, administration, the obligation to provide soldiers and supplies for future campaigns, but the preservation of its population and its physical structure. A city that resisted was, when taken, subjected to destruction and massacre on a scale calibrated to communicate a specific message to every other city in the region. Resistance is not merely futile but catastrophic, and the only rational choice is immediate submission. The Merv of 1221 was one of the most complete expressions of this logic. Merv was one of the largest cities in the medieval Islamic world, a centre of Islamic scholarship, commerce, and Persian cultural tradition, whose population may have been several 100,000 people. When the city resisted and was taken by storm, the population was ordered out onto the plain outside the city walls, divided into groups by occupation and status, and systematically killed over the course of several days. Contemporary accounts give casualty figures that historians now treat with appropriate skepticism. The numbers in the hundreds of thousands that Persian chroniclers record may reflect the scale of the shock, rather than literal accuracy. But the general fact of mass killing is not in dispute, and the Merv that Marco Polo passed through 50 years later was a shadow of the city that had existed before 1221. The cultural and demographic damage to the Islamic heartland of Central Asia from the Khwarezmian campaign was not recovered from for generations. The pursuit of Muhammad Asif himself, who fled across his own empire rather than stand and fight, led two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jibi and Subadeh, on one of the most remarkable cavalry rides in military history. A reconnaissance in force through Persia, the Caucasus, and into the Russian steppe that covered thousands of miles, defeated the Georgian army, the Cumans, and a combined Russian-Cuman force at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, and then returned to Mongolia with intelligence about the western regions that Genghis Khan would use in planning the campaigns that his successors would carry to the gates of Vienna. Muhammad II died of illness on an island in the Caspian Sea, a fugitive in his own empire, which is perhaps the most fitting end the Mongol campaign could have produced for a man whose specific provocation had generated it. The campaigns in northern China against the Xisha kingdom that occupied the modern province of Ningxia, and against the Jin dynasty that ruled Manchuria and northern China, were the other great military preoccupation of Genghis Khan's middle career, and they deserve careful attention because they reveal the specific challenges that the transition from steppe raiding to the conquest and administration of a large settled civilizations posed for the Mongol system. The Xia were a Tangut people who had built a sophisticated state in the arid region south of the Gobi Desert, and Genghis Khan campaigned against them repeatedly between 1205 and 1227, the last campaign ending in the final subjugation of the Xia in the year of his death. The Xia campaigns were not militarily the most challenging of his career, but they provided the laboratory in which the Mongol military learned siege warfare, and in which Genghis Khan developed his understanding of how to administer conquered agricultural populations rather than simply raiding them. The Jin dynasty was a more formidable opponent. The Yurchen people who had conquered northern China from the Song dynasty in the early 12th century, and who ruled one of the most advanced administrative states in the world, with a bureaucracy, a military and an economic base of a sophistication that dwarfed anything the steppe had produced. The campaigns against the Jin that began in 1211 established the pattern of the great confrontation between the Mongol military machine and Chinese civilization that would eventually produce the Mongol Yuan dynasty. But they also demonstrated the limits of steppe cavalry as an instrument of conquest in a landscape of fortified cities and intensive agriculture. The Mongols could raid and devastate the open countryside, could force pitched battles in which their cavalry tactics were decisive, but could not immediately take every major fortified city in northern China without the engineering capacity they were still developing. The campaigns against Jin lasted for decades. Genghis Khan began them and his successors completed them, and the administrative structures that the Mongols developed for ruling northern China were built on the foundation of captured Chinese bureaucrats and scholars who knew how agricultural taxation and urban administration worked and who were too valuable to kill. The Khitan administrator Yelu Chuchai was the most important of these captured experts, and his career under Genghis Khan and then Ögedei represents one of the most important intellectual contributions to the Mongol Empire's eventual success as an administrative entity. He had been a senior official of the Jin dynasty when the Mongols took Zhongdu, the Jin capital near modern Beijing, in 1215, and he entered Mongol service with sufficient distinction that Genghis Khan made him a personal advisor. Yelu Chuchai's primary contribution was the argument, made persistently and with considerable political courage in a court where military men of the steppe tradition found his perspective alien, that the destruction of the Chinese agricultural economy for short-term plunder was counterproductive, that living peasants paying regular taxes produced more long-term revenue than dead peasants and devastated farmland, and that the Mongol Empire needed to develop administrative institutions capable of extracting the surplus of the settled economies it was conquering in a sustainable way rather than simply consuming it in a single violent episode. Genghis Khan appears to have found this argument persuasive, or at least interesting enough to act on, and the administrative framework that Yelu Chuchai advocated, census-taking, regular taxation, the preservation of the urban commercial and artisan classes whose specialized skills the agrarian economy depended on, became the foundation of Mongol administrative practice in China. The specific decision not to destroy the agricultural population of northern China, to shift from raiding to conquest and administration, was one of the most important decisions of Genghis Khan's career, and it was not an obvious one in the steppe tradition. Several of his generals argued at various points that the most efficient use of the North Chinese agricultural land was to clear it of its human population and convert it to pasture, to remake the conquered territory in the image of the steppe. Genghis Khan rejected this argument, apparently because Yelu Chuchai and others like him had persuaded him that the agricultural economy was more valuable intact than it was destroyed, and that the Mongol Empire's long-term power depended on its ability to extract the surplus of settled civilizations, rather than its ability to replace them with a steppe economy that could not support the administrative and military needs of a world empire. The women of the Mongol world occupy a position in the historical record that is both more substantial and more consistently overlooked than the study of almost any other medieval civilization offers, and the specific women in Genghis Khan's life, above all Hoelun and Berta, deserve more careful attention than they typically receive, because their influence on his career was real, and the sources that record it are unusually direct. Hoelun's achievement in keeping her children alive through the years of destitution after Yasuke's death was not merely a maternal triumph. It was a demonstration of the specific capabilities that the steppe's division of labour had developed in the women who managed the household economy of the pastoral world. A Mongol woman of the warrior class was expected to manage the jur, the animals, the food supply, the textile production, and the social relationships of the household with a completeness that left the men of the household free to focus on herding, hunting, and warfare. In the absence of men, through death, through campaign, through capture, those same women were expected to perform whatever functions the situation required. Herlun performed functions that went well beyond the standard scope, keeping her family alive in conditions that would have broken anyone without her particular combination of practical skill, physical resilience, and the refusal to accept her circumstances as permanent that she seems to have transmitted directly to her eldest son. Her influence on Temüjin persisted well beyond his childhood. She appears in the secret history as a voice of counsel and sometimes of reproach. It was she who condemned the killing of Bekta. It was she who pushed back against some of the more extreme punitive measures that Temüjin applied to defeated enemies, and her opinions appear to have been taken seriously enough to modify his decisions on at least some occasions. She lived to see the Kurultai of 1206, and the secret history records that she was given a large and honoured appanage of people as a gift from her son at the Great Assembly, a formal recognition of the role she had played in making it possible. Berta's influence, as the senior wife of the Khan and the mother of his legitimate heirs, was the most consistently and most consequentially documented. She appears at several crucial moments in the narrative as an advisor whose counsel Genghis Khan sought and followed, the warning about Tebtengeri's dangerous political influence being the most dramatic instance, but not the only one. The secret history's portrait of her is of a woman of political intelligence who understood the court's dynamics clearly, and who used her access to the Khan to exercise a real, if informal, influence on major decisions. The Mongol court's political culture gave senior wives a recognized advisory role that was more visible than the role of queens and consorts in most of the settled civilizations Genghis Khan conquered, and Berta operated within that role with the effectiveness that the historical record, read carefully, makes visible. The specific status of women in Mongol law and custom was, by the standards of the medieval world, relatively favourable, though the word relatively is doing substantial work in that sentence. Women could inherit, could own property, could ride and hunt, and could exercise considerable authority within the household domain that the Mongol division of labour assigned to them. The senior wives of the Khan had specific political functions. They administered specific portions of the imperial appanage, received ambassadors and conducted diplomatic correspondence, and participated in the deliberations of the court in ways that went beyond purely domestic management. The regencies exercised by Mongol women during periods between the deaths of great Khans and the selection of their successors, Turagen Khatun, Ogaday's widow, and Ogul Kai Mish, Guyuk's widow, each serving as regents at crucial periods in the empire's political evolution, were substantive exercises of imperial power, not ceremonial roles, and they shaped the political history of the empire in ways whose importance Mongol historiography has only recently begun to fully acknowledge. The personal life of Genghis Khan, insofar as the sources allow it to be reconstructed, was shaped by the same duality that characterizes his public achievement: extraordinary capacity for loyalty and connection, alongside a capacity for violence and ruthlessness that the moral framework of his world accepted as natural consequences of power. His relationship with Berta was the emotional centre of his private life for its entire duration, and the sources suggest a genuine bond of mutual respect and affection that survived decades of separation, the Merkit kidnapping, the uncertainty about Yoshi's paternity, and the political demands of a career that kept him permanently in motion. He consulted her, He listened to her. The secret history preserves several instances of her counsel, influencing his decisions in ways that the court's male advisors had failed to accomplish. He also had multiple wives and concubines, as was expected of a ruler of his status in Mongol culture, and the children of those unions, particularly the 4 sons of Berta who were acknowledged as the legitimate heirs, formed the complex, contentious, and eventually destructive dynastic politics of the Mongol Empire after his death. Yochi, the eldest of Berta's sons, was the one whose paternity was publicly uncertain, and the tension between Yoshi and his brother Chagatai, who raised the paternity question explicitly in a confrontation before their father, was one of the sources of the dynastic instability that would eventually fracture the empire. Ögedei, the 3rd son, was chosen by Genghis Khan as his successor, a choice apparently made partly because Ögedei was the least contentious of his legitimate sons and the one most likely to hold the other brothers together. Tolui, the youngest of the 4 great sons, would be the ancestor of the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China. The specific question of religious belief is one where the sources present a genuinely complex picture. Genghis Khan was raised in the Mongol shamanic tradition, the cosmology that recognized Tengri, the eternal blue sky, as the supreme divine authority, and that communicated with the spirit world through the mediation of shamans whose ecstatic techniques allowed them to intercede with the powers governing human fate. He maintained this tradition throughout his life, consulting shamans before major decisions, offering sacrifices to Tengri before campaigns, and understanding his own authority as deriving from Tengri's explicit endorsement. The Shaman Teb Tengri's proclamation at the 1206 Kurultai was a specific instance of this understanding, the divine mandate made formally public. But he was also genuinely curious about other religious traditions in ways that went beyond strategic tolerance, engaging in conversations with Taoist monks who came to his camp, asking theological questions of Buddhist scholars, and reportedly being interested in the possibility that the religious traditions of the conquered civilizations contained knowledge that the steppe tradition did not. The Taoist master Chuchuji, who travelled from China to Central Asia in 1271 at Genghis Khan's invitation and spent several months in conversation with him, left a memoir of the journey that is one of the most remarkable cross-cultural documents of the medieval period, describing a conqueror who asked serious theological questions and listened to the answers with apparent attention. Teb Tengri, the shaman who had proclaimed his divine mandate, and who subsequently built a following and a political influence within the Mongol court that Genghis Khan eventually found threatening, met the fate of the man who overreached. When Teb Tengri's political maneuvering extended to undermining the influence of Genghis Khan's brothers, Berta intervened with unusual directness, warning her husband that the shaman was building a power within the court that would eventually challenge the Khan himself. Teb Tengri was killed by having his back broken in the manner that the Mongol tradition reserved for those of special status who deserved death, but not the spilling of blood. The episode illustrates both Berta's political role and Genghis Khan's willingness to eliminate threats that came from within his own circle rather than only from without. The return from the Khwarezmian campaign and the last years of Genghis Khan's life were occupied with the final subjugation of the Xixia and with the political organization of the empire he had built. The decisions about succession, about administrative structure, about the future direction of Mongol expansion that would shape everything that followed his death. He held a great Kurultai in 1225 or 1226, at which the major decisions about the empire's organization were made, designating Ögedei as his successor, dividing the empire's territory among his sons and their descendants in a way that created the appanage system. the allocation of specific regions as hereditary territories of specific branches of the family, that would eventually produce the successor Khanates of the post-Genghis Empire. The circumstances of his death in 1227 are uncertain in their specific detail, as the Mongols maintained deliberate secrecy around it. The most credible accounts suggest he died in the final Sisya campaign, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from a horse, possibly from illness. The secret history mentions a wound. He was approximately 65 years old, which was not young by the standards of his era, and which, for a man who had spent most of his adult life on campaign in conditions of significant physical hardship, was a respectable achievement. His body was returned to Mongolia for burial, and the specific location of his tomb remains unknown to this day, despite extensive scholarly and archaeological efforts to find it. The Mongol tradition was to maintain secrecy about the burial places of great leaders, and the account in Persian sources that the funeral cortege killed everyone it encountered along the route to prevent knowledge of the tomb's location, while probably exaggerated, reflects the genuine effort that was made to ensure that the grave remained undisturbed and undiscovered. The empire he left behind stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the eastern edge of Persia, encompassing most of Central Asia, significant portions of northern China, and the Mongol heartland itself. It was not yet at its maximum extent. The campaigns that would take the Mongol forces to Poland, Hungary, Korea, Vietnam, and the gates of Egypt were conducted by his sons and grandsons, using the military machine and the administrative framework he had created. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and commercial openness across the vast Mongol-controlled territory that followed the initial conquests, deserves more than a passing mention, because its specific character and its specific consequences are among the most consequential in the history of the pre-modern world, for both good and catastrophically bad reasons. The Silk Road, the network of overland trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean through Central Asia and the Middle East, had existed in various forms for centuries before the Mongol conquests, but it had always been fragmented by the political boundaries between the many states and empires that it crossed. Goods moved along it through a series of middlemen, each taking their margin, each imposing their taxes and their transit fees, each creating an obstruction to the direct long-distance movement of goods and information. The Mongol Empire, by placing the entire route from China to Persia under a single political authority with a single legal code and a single postal system, eliminated most of these frictions simultaneously. A merchant with the appropriate Mongol safe conduct, the paisa, the tablet of authority that allowed its holder to use the yam relay stations and claim the protection of the Mongol imperial authority, could move goods from the workshops of Hangzhou to the markets of Tabriz under a single commercial arrangement, paying taxes once rather than at every border. The consequences for the volume and variety of long-distance trade were substantial. Goods that had previously been available only to the very wealthy at the end of long, expensive, multi-stage trading chains became more widely available as the reduction in transaction costs brought prices down. The specific goods that moved in both directions along the Mongol routes — Chinese silk, porcelain, paper money, printing techniques, Central Asian horses, metalwork, textiles, Persian and Indian spices, dyes, precious stones, Western silver, woolen cloth, glasswork — were already goods of established value. What changed was the efficiency and the scale of the movement, and the specific consequence for certain technologies, above all for printing, paper-making, and gunpowder, that made the transfer of knowledge from east to west during the Pax Mongolica one of the most important events in the history of technology. Marco Polo, who travelled from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan between 1271 and 1275 and spent approximately 17 years in the service of the Yuan dynasty before returning home, is the most famous Western witness to the Pax Mongolica, and his account, The Travels, dictated in a Genoese prison to a Romance writer named Rustichello sometime around 1298, is one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval period, simultaneously a genuine record of observation and a text whose reliability is complicated by the conditions of its composition. Marco Polo described the Mongol postal relay system, the paper money of the Yuan dynasty, the coal that the Chinese burned for heating and industry, the asbestos cloth that resisted fire, the oil springs of Baku on the Caspian Sea, the pearl divers of the Persian Gulf, and dozens of other specific observations that have been individually verified by subsequent historical research, and that demonstrate that whoever is behind the Travels had genuinely seen the things described, whatever literary conventions Rustichello applied to the presentation. What the Pax Mongolica transmitted westward along with silk and spices and technology was something more lethal. The bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that lives in the fleas of rodents and that passes to humans with devastating and frequently fatal consequence, is a pathogen native to the Central Asian steppe, where it circulates in the rodent population without causing the kind of explosive human epidemic that requires dense human settlement and the specific conditions of long-distance trade. The Mongol campaigns and the Mongol trade network created exactly those conditions, moving large numbers of people and animals across the steppe, concentrating them in supply depots and trading posts, linking the flea-infested rodent population of the Central Asian steppe to the commercial networks that connected Central Asia to China in one direction and to Persia and the Mediterranean in the other. The outbreak that reached Crimea in 1346 was carried to Messina by Genoese trading ships in 1347 and swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing approximately a third of the continent's population. The Black Death was carried along the trade routes that the Mongol Empire had made more efficient by the rats and fleas that travelled with the same goods the traders were moving. The Pax Mongolica that facilitated the transmission of printing and papermaking and silk and spices across Eurasia also facilitated the transmission of the most lethal epidemic in European history. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and commercial openness across the vast Mongol-controlled territory that followed the initial conquests, was not something Genghis Khan lived to see, but it was something his empire made possible, and its consequences for the transmission of goods, ideas, and diseases across Eurasia were among the most far-reaching in the history of the pre-modern world. The immediate successors of Genghis Khan completed the conquests he'd begun and extended them in directions that he had identified but not yet pursued. The campaigns that extended Mongol power into Russia and Eastern Europe were among the most consequential in the entire history of Mongol expansion, both for their immediate military achievement and for their long-term political consequences, which shaped the development of the Russian state and the political culture of Eastern Europe across the following centuries in ways whose marks are still visible today. The Mongol commanders who led the Western campaigns, above all Sube'etei, now in his 60s and arguably the greatest purely military commander the Mongols produced, planning his fourth major campaign across his lifetime against the peoples of the Western steppe and beyond, had intelligence gathered from the reconnaissance campaign of Yebe and Sube'etei in 1221 to 1223, when they had first fought the Rus princes and the Cumans, and had assessed the military capabilities and the political divisions of the Western steppe, with the careful professional attention that Mongol operational planning always applied. Subadin knew what he was going to find in Russia and Poland and Hungary, because he or his subordinates had been there before, had studied the terrain and the enemies and the political situations, and had spent 15 years preparing the military and logistical framework for a campaign that would be the largest the Mongols had yet attempted in the West. The Russ's principalities that the Mongol forces encountered in the winter of 1237 to 1238 were not a single state, but a collection of competing city-states: Vladimir, Ryazan, Novgorod, Kiev, Galish, and a dozen others, whose inter-principality rivalries had made coordinated military response to the Mongol threat essentially impossible. The princes who received warnings of the Mongol advance had the same response that every potential Mongol victim had. The news was worse than seemed possible. The distance between the reported Mongol forces and their own territory was being rapidly closed in ways that the intelligence suggested were not credible, and the political relationships between the various princes were too fractured by recent conflicts to produce the kind of joint response that the situation required. Ryazan fell in December 1237 after a 5-day siege. Vladimir fell in February 1238. City after city across northern Russia was taken in the same winter campaign, the Mongol forces using the frozen rivers as highways in a season when the Rus princes had assumed military operations were impossible. The famous near miss of Novgorod, the great commercial city of northern Russia, the richest city in the Rus world, whose trade connections to the Baltic and to the Hanseatic network made it the most economically important city in the region, was the consequence of the spring thaw, rather than of any Mongol decision to spare it. The Mongol forces, approaching from the south, turned back approximately 100 kilometers short of Novgorod, when the winter's frozen ground began to thaw, and the marshy terrain of the region became impassable for the cavalry force and the supply wagons that the Mongol army required. Whether they would have been turned back by Novgorod's fortifications and its larger-than-average garrison is uncertain. The circumstances of the near miss prevented the test from occurring. The subsequent consolidation of Mongol power over the Russian steppe, the establishment of the Golden Horde on the lower Volga at the city of Sarai as the western successor Khanate, was not merely an episode in Mongol expansion but a 2-century feature of Russian political life, whose consequences for the development of the Russian state remain one of the most debated questions in Russian historiography. The princes of the Rus were required to travel to Sarai to receive their patents of authority from the Khan, to pay regular tribute and to supply soldiers for Mongol campaigns. Some princes, most famously Alexander Nevsky, the Prince of Novgorod who defeated Swedish and Teutonic invaders on the Neva, and the frozen Lake Peipus while simultaneously cultivating good relations with the Golden Horde, pursued a conscious strategy of cooperation with the Mongols while resisting the Western threats that Mongol preoccupation with the East left them to deal with independently. The Mongol period, its defenders argue in the Russian historiographical tradition, preserved the core of Russ's cultural and Orthodox Christian identity by providing an Eastern patron powerful enough to deter Western Catholic absorption. Its critics argue that it imposed on Russia the specific authoritarian political culture, the absolutism, the acceptance of arbitrary rule, the weakness of the intermediary institutions between the ruler and the individual, that distinguished Russia from the Western European states that were developing representative institutions during the same period. Both arguments contain elements of truth, and the debate between them is genuinely unresolved. Ögedei, who ruled as Great Khan from 1229 to 1241, was in some respects the most important of the successors in terms of institutional development. He established the Mongol capital at Karakorum, a permanent city in the Mongolian steppe that became the administrative centre of the empire, with ambassadors from China and Persia and Russia and the papacy all maintaining representatives there simultaneously. He completed the conquest of northern China, subjugated Korea, and sent the Great Western Campaign under Batu Khan and Subedai that destroyed the armies of Poland and Hungary in 1241 and reached the Adriatic coast before Ögedei's death brought the campaign to a halt. The Mongol forces withdrawing to participate in the Kurultai that would choose a new Great Khan, leaving the rulers of Western Europe to debate, in the aftermath, what they had just been spared from. The question of what would have happened if the Mongol Western advance had continued past Hungary and into Western Europe has occupied historians for centuries without definitive resolution. The Western European states were not militarily capable of stopping the Mongol force that had just destroyed the combined armies of Poland and Hungary in the same week. Lenica and Mohi, the two battles fought within days of each other in April 1241, demonstrated that European cavalry and European fortifications were not adequate to the Mongol tactics that had overwhelmed the armies of Central Asia and northern China. The fortified cities of Western Europe might have provided more substantial obstacles. The Mongol siege capacity had limits that the flat terrain and relatively unfortified landscape of the Polish and Hungarian plains had not fully tested. But the likelihood that the Mongol military machine of 1241 under Subedai's command would have been stopped before reaching the Atlantic is one that military historians tend to assess as low. What actually stopped the Mongols in Europe was Ögedei's death and the political requirement to return east for the succession, a contingency that reminds us again of the specific role of individual lives in the largest historical events. The dynastic politics that prevented the Mongol Empire from selecting a new Great Khan quickly, the infighting among Ögedei's sons and Tolui's sons, and the other branches of the family that kept the empire effectively leaderless for several years after Ögedei's death, was the specific human reality that gave Western Europe the breathing space it needed. Mungke Khan, Tolui's son, who ruled as Great Khan from 1251 to 1259, launched the campaigns that would bring Mongol power to the Middle East. His brother Hulagu's force took Baghdad in 1258, killing the Abbasid Caliph and ending a caliphate that had been the symbolic centre of the Islamic world for 5 centuries. The sack of Baghdad was one of the most traumatic events in the history of Islamic civilization, and the stories that surrounded it, of books thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink, of the destruction of the great libraries of the Islamic Golden Age, became the symbolic image of Mongol destruction in the Islamic world, in the same way that the razing of the Cilician monasteries and the sack of Kiev had become the symbol in the Christian world. Mungke's death in 1259 during the campaign in China created another succession crisis, and the Mongol advance into the Levant was halted by the Mamluks of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first significant defeat of a Mongol force in the field, and a defeat that prevented the Mongol conquest of Egypt and North Africa that might otherwise have followed. By the time of Kublai Khan, Mungke's brother, who ruled as Great Khan from 1260 until his death in 1294, and who is the Mongol ruler that Marco Polo's account made most famous in Western imagination, the empire had effectively fractured into 4 successor states: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai, the Ilkhanate in Persia under Hulagu's descendants, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe. These successor states continued to be nominally part of a single empire under the authority of the Great Khan, but in practical terms they were independent entities whose rulers pursued their own policies and who were sometimes at war with each other. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and commercial integration that the Mongol Empire made possible across its enormous territory, was the product of this era of the successor Khanate, rather than of the conquest period itself, and it was during this era that the trade routes that connected China to Persia to the Mediterranean were most actively used, that the bubonic plague that would become the Black Death made its way westward along those routes, and that the cultural exchanges that modernity later tried to attribute to the Renaissance were most intensively occurring. The legacy of Genghis Khan is one of the most contested questions in historical writing, and the contest reflects genuine disagreement about how to evaluate a historical figure whose achievements were inseparable from violence on a scale that defies comfortable accommodation. The population loss from the Mongol conquests. The most careful modern estimates suggest somewhere between 30 and 40 million people killed over the period of the conquests, in a world whose total population was perhaps 400 million, represents a proportion of the human species that has no parallel in any other single historical event before the 20th century. The specific demographic damage to certain regions. Central Asia lost perhaps 3/4 of its population in the course of the Mongol campaigns, and the recovery of the region's urban and agricultural civilization took centuries, is visible in the archaeological record and in the DNA of modern populations in ways that the scale of the catastrophe demands to be honestly stated. The simultaneously positive case, the Pax Mongolica, the religious tolerance, the trade routes, the transmission of knowledge and technology across Eurasia, is real but requires careful framing. The peace and commercial openness of the Pax Mongolica were the direct products of conquest and destruction on the scale just described, and the people who benefited from the Silk Road trade in the mid-13th century were living in an environment created by the elimination of a significant fraction of the human beings who had previously inhabited it. The bubonic plague that travelled those trade routes in the 1340s and killed a third of Europe's population was itself a direct consequence of the ecological and demographic disruptions that the Mongol conquests produced. The accounting of costs and benefits is not one that resolves cleanly in either direction. What is unambiguously true is that the Mongol Empire was the most transformative single political event in the history of the Eurasian continent, and that the world it produced, through both its direct effects and the responses it generated in the civilizations it touched, is the world that eventually became the early modern world of the 15th and 16th centuries, with its European maritime expansion, its gunpowder empires in the Middle East and South Asia, and its emerging global commercial networks. The specific transmission of technologies from China to the Islamic world to Europe, gunpowder, printing, paper-making, advanced metallurgy, was facilitated and accelerated by the Mongol commercial networks. The specific political dynamics of the successor states, the Timurid Renaissance in Central Asia, the Mughal Empire in India, the Ottoman Empire whose founders served under Mongol masters, the Muscovite Principality whose rise to dominance over the Russian steppe was shaped by its position within and eventually against the Golden Horde, were all direct products of the Mongol imperial project. Even the European voyages of discovery that eventually produced the age of colonialism were partly driven by the aspiration to find sea routes to the goods that the Mongol land routes had made available to European consumers, and that the collapse of Mongol power and the Ottoman closure of the overland routes were making increasingly expensive to obtain. The specific figure of Genghis Khan himself, the man, as distinct from the empire, left a physical legacy that is simultaneously impossible to find and impossible to miss. His tomb has never been discovered. There is no monument to him in the Western world comparable to the monuments to other great conquerors, partly because the civilizations that might have built one were the ones his armies destroyed. His DNA, on the other hand, is one of the most widely distributed in the human genome. A 2003 study suggested that approximately 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome haplotype that can be traced to a single man living in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago, a concentration of genetic legacy that has no parallel in any other documented individual in human history. The estimate that the number of his direct descendants may number in the hundreds of millions speaks to something that the political and military record alone does not fully capture. The specific way in which a life of conquest, power, and the social conditions that absolute power created, the taking of women from every conquered people, the harems of the Mongol imperial court, translated into a biological legacy that the modern world carries in its bodies without knowing it. The primary source for the life of Genghis Khan, the text that provides most of what we know about his early years, his character, and the specific events of the unification period, is the secret history of the Mongols, and it deserves careful attention both as a historical document and as a cultural artifact, because its specific character shapes everything that can be said about its subject. The secret history was written down shortly after Genghis Khan's death. The best scholarly estimate is sometime in the 1220s or 1230s, with later additions and compilations across the following decades, by an author or authors whose identity is not known, and whose specific position within the Mongol court gave them access to traditions, memories, and oral accounts that have no other surviving source. The title refers not to the document's content being secret, but to its being an internal document, a history of the Mongol people and the Mongol royal family, written for Mongol audiences rather than for the conquered peoples whose Persian and Chinese chronicles of the Mongol conquest have different purposes and different perspectives. The text was eventually written in Mongolian using the Yugur script, with Chinese transcriptions of the Mongolian text surviving in the archives of the Ming dynasty, and its recovery and translation into European languages was one of the great scholarly achievements of the 19th and 20th centuries. What makes the secret history unusual as a medieval text is its willingness to preserve material that is unflattering to its subject. Temüjin's killing of Begta, his moments of apparent vulnerability, his failures and defeats alongside his successes, and the specific quality of his relationship with Jamuka, which includes passages of genuine emotional intimacy that most medieval royal historiography would have smoothed out into conventional heroic narrative. The secret history reads less like the hagiographies that settled civilizations produced for their great rulers and more like what it probably was, an oral tradition shaped by the specific values of the steppe culture, in which a man was judged by his deeds rather than by a consistent narrative of heroic virtue, and in which the tensions and contradictions of a great man's life were preserved because they were understood as part of what made him great. The Mongol cosmology within which the secret history situates Temujin's career is the shamanic tradition of the Mongolian steppe. The understanding of the world as a place where human beings existed within a web of relationships with spirit powers, nature spirits, ancestral spirits, and the great cosmic forces represented by Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and Etugan, the earth, who together constituted the divine order within which human political authority operated. The shaman, the Bu in the male form and the Udgan in the female, was the practitioner who could communicate with these powers, who could intercede on behalf of the community, who could diagnose the spiritual causes of illness and misfortune and provide the rituals that addressed them. Teb Tengri's role in the 1206 Kurultai, the proclamation of Tengri's mandate for Temujin's universal rule, was the specific application of shamanic authority to the political question of legitimation, the claim that the conqueror's power was not merely military but cosmically sanctioned. The specific Mongol understanding of what Tengri's mandate meant, the belief that Genghis Khan and his successors had been explicitly commissioned by the supreme divine force to rule the world, and that the resistance of any human political authority to Mongol power was therefore not merely military insubordination, but cosmic impiety, was the theological foundation of the Mongol ultimatums that preceded their military campaigns. The letters that Mongol commanders sent to the rulers they were about to attack, demanding submission on the grounds that Tengri had granted the Mongols dominion over all peoples under the sky, and warning that resistance would bring the violence that the divine will decreed, were not merely diplomatic formulas. They expressed a genuine theological conviction that organized and sustained the Mongol political project across generations, providing the ideological coherence that an empire of such geographic and cultural diversity required. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero of the First Order. His image on the currency, his name on the airport, his statue on the steppe south of Ulaanbaatar, one of the largest equestrian statues in the world, a warrior on horseback pointing east toward the territory he conquered. The rehabilitation of Genghis Khan as a Mongolian national symbol, repressed during the Soviet period when Mongolian nationalism was politically suspect and Genghis Khan was officially a feudal oppressor, has been one of the most enthusiastic exercises in historical reclamation of the post-Soviet era. The specific version of the story that Mongolian national identity has chosen to emphasize, the unifier, the lawgiver, the man who lifted the Mongolian people from warring tribes to world power, is not false, but it is, like all national mythologies, selective. The Mongolian Genghis Khan and the Central Asian or Chinese or Persian Genghis Khan are not the same person, which is perhaps the most honest way to describe a figure whose legacy is genuinely different, depending on whose ancestors he conquered. The steppe that produced him is still there. The grass still runs east to west. The wind still crosses it with the consistency of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time. And the horses that descend from the same small, sturdy breed that carried his armies across half the world still move across it in the herds of the families who maintain the pastoral tradition that Temüjin was born into. The cities that he destroyed, Merv, Nishapur, Urgench, Zhongdu, are in various states of ruin and rebuilding, some of them occupied by modern cities that have grown on top of their foundations, some of them purely archaeological, some of them partially restored and partially excavated, their stones carrying the specific silence that places carry when something very large happened in them, and the world moved on without fully accounting for it. The trade routes that the Mongol Empire opened or reinforced are now highways and railways and container ship lanes, following roughly the same geographic logic that the Silk Road caravans followed, because the geography of Eurasia has not changed, and the efficient routes across it are the same routes they have always been. The political entities that the Mongol Empire produced, the nations and states of Central Asia, the institutions of the Russian state, the administrative traditions of China, the cultural and religious geography of the Islamic world, are still the political entities that exist today, modified by 6 centuries of subsequent history, but bearing in their structure the marks of the Mongol imperial period in ways that historians of each of those regions can trace in specific detail. The man himself was, in the end, a man, a specific person who was born on the banks of a specific river in approximately 1162, who spent his childhood eating rats and pine nuts to survive, who made alliances and broke alliances and killed brothers and raised enemies' children and built something that had never existed before, and who died in approximately 1227, somewhere in the vicinity of the Sisya campaign, without seeing the full extent of what he had put in motion. The universal ruler, the oceanic ruler, the ruler of everything under the eternal blue sky. He was these things, and he was also a man who had been a frightened child on the steppe, who had slept in ditches and eaten what he could find, who had loved a woman named Berta and stayed loyal to that love across 60 years of the most demanding life the medieval world produced. The specific quality that the Mongol tradition identified as the central virtue of the warrior was something they called jayagan, destiny or fate, and the belief that a man of sufficient power and sufficient vision was not merely living within the flow of fate, but directing it, bending it toward his own purposes in cooperation with the will of Tengri. Genghis Khan believed this about himself, and the evidence of his life suggests that the belief was not entirely wrong. He bent the flow of the medieval world's history more completely than any other single individual, and the direction he bent it toward has never straightened back to what it was before. The night is very late now, and the story of the man who came from nothing and remade the world has reached its end, or the end of the part of it that one night can contain. The steppe is dark and vast, and the wind is doing what it has always done, and somewhere under a hill in Mongolia that no one has found, there is a grave that holds what remains of the man who united the tribes and broke the cities, and connected the civilizations and killed the millions, and opened the trade routes and promulgated the laws, and died with his boots on in a campaign he had not yet finished. The eternal blue sky that he believed authorized him is the same sky that looks down on the steppe tonight, indifferent to the questions that historians ask about his legacy, patient with the disagreements that people who are not there will never fully resolve. Let that settle around you now. The grass is there, and the wind is there, and the horses are moving in the dark somewhere on the steppe. The small sturdy ones that can find grass under snow and cover 200 miles in a day, and carry their riders into the history of the world. The fire in the gur is low, the children are asleep, the shaman has finished speaking. Outside, the eternal blue sky holds everything. Rest easy.